He ripped my badge off in front of everyone, laughing as he said I wasn't fit to serve. I stood there, humiliated, holding back the tears of a soldier's daughter. He had no idea who I was, no idea that the man who trained him, the one he feared the most, was my father. When my parents found out what he did, it was already too late. Before I tell you what happened that day, hit the like button, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. Because this isn't just a story about revenge, it's about respect. You want to know what it feels like to have your dreams crushed in front of 20 people? To stand there while grown men laugh at you like you're some kind of joke? Let me paint you a picture of that day, the day that changed everything, the day that taught me that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't violence, it's patience. The briefing room was cold that morning. Not just temperature cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones when you know something's about to go wrong. I'd been assigned to Admiral Harrison's command for exactly 3 days. 3 days of sideways glances, whispered comments, and that particular brand of military machismo that some men wear like armor against their own insecurities. I walked into that briefing room with my head high, my uniform pressed to perfection, and my badge gleaming on my chest. That badge wasn't just metal and fabric to me, it represented every dawn I'd woken up at 4 a.m. for training, every mile I'd run until my lungs burned, every tear I'd swallowed when the instructors pushed me past what I thought were my limits. That badge was my father's legacy living through me, even though nobody in that room knew it yet. Admiral Harrison was standing at the front, his back to the door when I entered. The conversation died the moment I stepped inside. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and suddenly everyone's watching you like you don't belong? That was every second of those 3 days, magnified by 1,000. He turned around slowly, dramatically, like he was performing for an audience. And I guess he was. 20 junior officers, all watching, all waiting to see what the great Admiral Harrison would do with the woman who'd somehow infiltrated their boys' club. You. His voice dripped with disdain, each syllable calculated to cut. In my command room, I stood at attention, every fiber of my being focused on maintaining my composure. This wasn't my first rodeo with discrimination, but something about his tone, something about the way his lips curled into that smug smile, told me this was going to be different. This was going to hurt. Hand over your badge and leave. For words. For simple words that felt like a knife twisting in my chest. Not because I was afraid of him. I'd faced down men twice his size in training. Not because I doubted my abilities. I'd earned every stripe, every commendation, every right to be in that room. It hurt because of what that badge meant to me, what it represented, and how casually he was trying to strip it away. The laughter started small. A chuckle from someone in the back. Then another. Then it spread like wildfire through the room until I was standing in the center of a chorus of mockery. 20 grown men, trained killers, reduced to schoolyard bullies by the permission of their commanding officer. I want you to understand something about military bearing. It's not just about standing straight or following orders. It's about maintaining dignity under pressure, about representing something bigger than yourself even when the whole world seems to be against you. My father taught me that. Not just with words, but with his life, with his example, with every story he ever told me about real leadership. So I reached up, my hand trembling despite every ounce of control I was trying to maintain, and I unpinned that badge. The metal felt heavier than it should have, weighed down by the hopes and dreams I'd attached to it. I held it for just a moment, feeling the engraving under my fingertips, remembering the day I'd first earned the right to wear it. "That's right," Harrison said, his voice full of satisfaction. "Walk away. This isn't a place for little girls playing dress-up." More laughter. Someone actually applauded. I could feel their eyes on me as I placed the badge in his outstretched palm, as I turned toward the door, as I walked the longest 20 feet of my life while maintaining perfect military posture. But here's what they didn't see. Here's what Admiral Harrison, in all his arrogance, couldn't possibly understand. As I walked out of that room, I wasn't broken. I was remembering. remembering who I was, where I came from, and what kind of blood ran through my veins. You see, Admiral Harrison thought he was dealing with some random recruit who'd gotten lucky, who'd somehow slipped through the cracks of a system designed to keep people like me out. He thought breaking me would prove his power, would show everyone in that room that he was the king of his little domain. He had no idea that the woman he'd just humiliated was the daughter of General Marcus Stone. Let me tell you about my father. Not the legend, not the man whose name makes colonels and admirals straighten their spines, the father. The man who taught me that strength isn't about how loud you can yell or how many people you can intimidate. It's about how much you can endure without losing yourself. I was 7 years old the first time I saw him in full dress uniform. We were at a military ceremony, and I watched grown men approach him with something that went beyond respect. It was reverence. They spoke to him in hushed tones, hung on his every word, and when he walked past, conversation stopped. "Daddy," I whispered, tugging on his uniform jacket, "why is everyone so scared of you?" He knelt down to my level, his face serious but kind. "They're not scared, sweetheart. They're showing respect. There's a difference. Fear is what weak leaders use to control people. Respect is what you earn through your actions." That conversation shaped everything that came after. Every training session in our backyard, every lesson about honor and integrity, every story about real leadership versus the kind of authority that comes from a title alone. When I was 15, he took me to watch the Navy SEAL qualification trials. We sat in the stands as candidates pushed themselves beyond human endurance, and I watched men who looked like mountains crumble under the pressure. "See that one there?" He pointed to a candidate who was clearly struggling, falling behind the pack. "He's going to make it." "How do you know?" I asked. "Because he's not fighting the ocean. He's not fighting the instructors. He's fighting himself, and that's the only battle that matters." That candidate did make it. And so did I, 8 years later, when I decided to follow in my father's footsteps. Not because it was easy, not because anyone expected it of me, but because he taught me that the hardest paths often lead to the most meaningful destinations. The SEAL training almost broke me. I won't lie about that. There were nights when I called home, sobbing into the phone, begging to come back to the world of normal people with normal problems. But every time I was ready to quit, I heard his voice in my head. "Pain is temporary, daughter. Discipline is forever." So I pushed through. Through the freezing ocean dives at 3 a.m., through the instructors who seemed determined to prove that I didn't belong, through the physical and mental torture designed to separate the committed from the curious. I earned my place in that elite brotherhood, one bloody day at a time. And that's what made Admiral Harrison's humiliation so much worse. He wasn't just stripping a badge from some random soldier. He was spitting on years of sacrifice, on a legacy of service that ran deeper than his comprehension, on the kind of honor that his kind of leadership could never understand. But I walked out of that room with my head high because I knew something he didn't. I knew that respect isn't something you can demand at gunpoint or humiliate out of people. I knew that real power doesn't need to announce itself with cruelty. And I knew that somewhere, in a secure office hundreds of miles away, sat a man who'd taught me these lessons, a man who wouldn't take kindly to hearing that his daughter had been publicly disrespected by someone who should have known better. The drive home was the longest of my life. Not because of the distance, but because of the weight of shame and anger I was carrying. I kept replaying the scene, wondering if I should have fought back, should have said something, should have stood up for myself instead of walking away. But then I remembered another lesson from my father. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let your enemies reveal themselves. Sometimes patience is the strongest weapon in your arsenal. My apartment felt smaller than usual that night. I sat on my couch, still in uniform, staring at the wall where my commendations hung. 27 certificates, medals, and awards, proof of a career built on excellence, on pushing beyond limitations, on serving something greater than myself. And with one cruel laugh, Admiral Harrison had tried to erase all of it. I didn't call my parents that night. I needed time to process, time to figure out how to explain what had happened without letting the pain show in my voice. My mother had already sacrificed enough sleep worrying about me in combat zones. My father had already fought enough battles for equality and justice in his own career. I didn't want to burden them with this. But the military is a small community, smaller than most people realize. News travels fast, especially when it's bad news, especially when it involves the kind of public humiliation that makes for good gossip. The call came at 6 a.m. the next morning. I was already awake, had been staring at the ceiling for hours, when my phone rang with my father's ringtone. Sarah. His voice was calm, controlled, but I could hear something underneath, the kind of quiet fury that made seasoned warriors nervous. Hi, Dad. I heard about yesterday. 3 words. That's all it took for the dam to break. All the composure I'd maintained, all the military bearing I'd wrapped around myself like armor, crumbled in an instant. Dad, You don't need to explain anything to me. You handled it with more grace than he deserved. I could hear my mother in the background, her voice thick with emotion. She was crying, not the soft tears of sadness, but the fierce tears of a mother whose child has been wounded. In that moment, I realized that my humiliation wasn't just mine to carry. It belonged to everyone who'd ever believed in me, everyone who'd invested in my success, everyone who'd taught me that honor meant something. What's his name? My father asked. Dad, please don't. His name, Sarah. There was no arguing with that tone. I'd heard it exactly 3 times in my life, and each time it had preceded a reckoning that changed everything. Admiral Harrison. Silence. Long, heavy silence that seemed to stretch across the phone lines and fill my apartment with its weight. I see. 2 words that somehow contained more threat than any shouted declaration of war. Dad, I can handle this myself. I don't need you to. This isn't about what you need, sweetheart. This is about what's right. The line went dead. I stared at my phone, knowing that somewhere in the Pentagon, wheels were already in motion. My father wasn't the kind of man who made idle threats or empty promises. When General Marcus Stone said he was going to handle something, it got handled. I tried to go about my day normally. I showered, I ate breakfast, I attempted to read the news. But every few minutes, I found myself wondering what was happening in offices I'd never seen, in conversations I wasn't part of, in the machinery of military justice that I'd always believed in but never had to depend on. The waiting was agony. Not knowing what my father was planning, not knowing if I'd made the right choice in telling him, not knowing if this would make things better or infinitely worse. In the military, retaliation is a real concern. Reporting misconduct doesn't always lead to justice. Sometimes it leads to more creative forms of punishment. By afternoon, I was a wreck. I'd cleaned my apartment twice, reorganized my closet, and done enough push-ups to qualify for another fitness test. Anything to keep my mind off the growing certainty that I'd just started a war I wasn't equipped to fight. That's when my phone rang again. This time it was my mother. Baby girl, she said, her voice gentle but determined, I need you to know something. What that man did to you, that wasn't about military protocol or standards or any of the excuses he'll try to make. That was about his own insecurity, his own fear of change, his own inability to lead with dignity. I could hear the pain in her voice. My mother was a colonel herself, had fought her own battles against discrimination and prejudice throughout her career. She knew exactly what I was feeling because she'd felt it herself. I keep thinking I should have said something, I whispered. Should have defended myself instead of just walking away. You did exactly what you should have done. You maintained your honor when he lost his. You showed more leadership in those 5 minutes than he's shown in his entire career. But Mom, what if Dad does something that makes it worse? What if? Your father isn't going to make it worse, sweetheart. He's going to make it right. There was something in her voice, a certainty that went beyond hope or wishful thinking. She knew something I didn't, understood something about the way this world worked that I was still learning. How do you know? Because I've been married to Marcus Stone for 32 years, and I've never seen him fail to keep a promise. Especially not when it comes to protecting the people he loves. We talked for another hour about leadership and integrity, about the price of progress and the cost of standing up for what's right. By the time we hung up, I felt steadier, more centered, more ready for whatever was coming. But I still wasn't prepared for what actually happened. The next morning, Admiral Harrison received what would later be described as the most urgent classified order of his career. Report to Pentagon headquarters immediately. Classified briefing. Transportation has been arranged. I wasn't supposed to know about this, but military communications have a way of reaching the people who need to hear them. One of my instructors from SEAL training, a Master Chief who'd served under my father years earlier, called to give me a heads up. "Your old man's moving pieces on the board," he said cryptically. "Thought you should know." "What kind of pieces?" "The kind that rearranged the whole game." I spent that day in a state of nervous energy unlike anything I'd experienced in combat. At least in a firefight, you know what you're facing. You can see the enemy, understand the terrain, make tactical decisions based on observable information. This was different. This was watching forces beyond my control reshape the world around me, and all I could do was wait for the dust to settle. The Pentagon is an intimidating building under the best of circumstances. For Admiral Harrison, walking into that maze of power and protocol while knowing he'd been summoned for reasons he couldn't understand, it must have felt like entering his own tomb. Security escorted him through corridors he'd walked 100 times before, but something was different now. The looks from other officers, the whispered conversations that stopped when he passed, the sense that everyone knew something he didn't. By the time he reached Conference Room Alpha 7, his confidence was already beginning to crack. He opened the door expecting to find a routine briefing, maybe some administrative issue that needed his attention, possibly even a new assignment or commendation. What he found instead was a tribunal. At the head of the conference table sat General Marcus Stone, dressed in full formal uniform, his ribbons and decorations creating a rainbow of service across his chest. His expression was unreadable, but his presence filled the room like a storm system moving in from the horizon. To the general's right sat Colonel Patricia Stone, my mother, her own impressive array of service ribbons telling the story of a career dedicated to breaking barriers and building bridges. Her face showed the controlled emotion of a mother who'd seen her child hurt and was now watching justice unfold. And behind them both, standing at attention in dress whites that seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights, was me. Not the broken, humiliated woman who'd walked out of a briefing room 3 days earlier, but a Navy SEAL in full regalia, every decoration earned through blood and sacrifice. Every stripe a testament to dedication that men like Admiral Harrison would never understand. The silence in that room was deafening. Harrison stood in the doorway for a full 10 seconds, his brain trying to process what he was seeing, trying to understand how his world had shifted so dramatically without his knowledge. "Admiral Harrison," my father said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that doesn't need volume to command attention. "Please have a seat." It wasn't a request. Harrison moved like a man walking to his execution, each step heavy with the growing realization that he'd made a mistake bigger than his ability to understand or control. He pulled out a chair and sat down, his eyes darting between the three of us, trying to find some explanation that would make this make sense. "You removed a soldier's badge 3 days ago," my father continued, sliding a folder across the table. "I'd like to review the circumstances of that decision." Harrison's face went pale as he opened the folder. Inside were photos from the briefing room, testimony from witnesses, and a complete transcript of what had transpired. Someone had been very thorough, very detailed, and very quick to compile evidence that painted a picture of systematic discrimination and abuse of authority. "Sir," Harrison began, his voice shaking slightly, "I was maintaining discipline in my command." "The soldier in question." Lieutenant Sarah Stone, my mother interjected, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. The soldier's name is Lieutenant Sarah Stone. And she's my daughter. The color drained completely from Harrison's face. I watched him connect the dots, watched him realize that the woman he'd humiliated in front of his men wasn't some anonymous recruit he could push around without consequences. She was the daughter of the most respected general in the armed forces, the child of parents who commanded more real authority than he could dream of accumulating. Now, my father said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than a shout, let's review your own record. What happened next was the most methodical, devastating character assassination I've ever witnessed. My father didn't raise his voice, didn't make threats, didn't engage in the kind of dramatic confrontation you see in movies. He simply presented facts. Evidence of falsified reports that covered up Harrison's own failures in leadership. Documentation of previous incidents where he'd used his authority to belittle and humiliate subordinates. Financial records showing questionable decisions that prioritized his comfort over his troops' welfare. Personnel files revealing a pattern of discrimination that went far beyond what had happened to me. Each revelation landed like a physical blow. Harrison's shoulders sagged further with every document, every testimony, every piece of evidence that revealed him not as the strong leader he pretended to be, but as a petty tyrant who'd confused fear with respect for so long that he'd forgotten the difference. You mocked the daughter of the man who made you who you are, my father said finally, his voice heavy with disappointment. You forgot that respect isn't something you can demand through humiliation. You forgot that leadership means lifting people up, not tearing them down to make yourself feel bigger. Harrison tried to speak, tried to offer some explanation or apology that might salvage what remained of his career, but my father held up a hand for silence. The uniform you wear represents something bigger than your ego, Admiral. It represents the sacrifice of millions of Americans who believed in ideals worth dying for. When you strip a badge from a qualified soldier because of your own prejudices, you spit on every grave in Arlington Cemetery. The words hit like hammer blows. I could see Harrison shrinking in his chair, the weight of his actions finally becoming clear to him. But it was too late for understanding, too late for regret, too late for anything but consequences. You'll remember respect now, my father continued, but you'll remember it without your uniform. He slid another document across the table, court-martial proceedings, formal charges, a complete dismantling of everything Harrison had spent his career building. The man who'd thought he could humiliate me with impunity was about to discover what real powerlessness felt like. Sir, Harrison whispered, his voice barely audible, I didn't know. That's the problem, my father cut him off. You never bothered to know. You saw someone you thought was weak, someone you thought you could push around without consequences, and you let your prejudices blind you to reality. You forgot that every person in uniform has a story, has value, has earned their place through sacrifice you can't imagine. I stepped forward then, my voice steady despite the emotions churning inside me. You took my badge to mock me, I said, looking directly into Harrison's eyes. Now I wear it to remind you that respect is earned, not demanded. That real strength comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down. That the measure of a leader isn't how many people fear them, but how many people they inspire to be better than they thought possible. Harrison lowered his eyes, unable to meet my gaze. The man who'd laughed at my humiliation 3 days earlier couldn't even look at the woman he'd tried to break. In that moment, I understood something profound about power and justice. It's not about revenge or getting even. It's about making sure the right lessons are learned, the right precedents are set, the right standards are upheld. The proceedings will begin Monday morning, my father said, gathering the documents. You'll be relieved of command immediately, pending the outcome of your court-martial. Your service record will reflect the true nature of your leadership, not the fiction you've been selling. Harrison sat in stunned silence as the full weight of the situation settled over him. His career was over. His reputation was destroyed. The authority he'd wielded like a weapon had been turned against him, revealing him as the weak, insecure man he'd always been underneath the uniform. But here's what struck me most about that moment. I didn't feel satisfaction. I didn't feel vindicated or triumphant. What I felt was sadness for how unnecessary all of this had been. If Harrison had simply treated me with the basic respect due to any qualified service member, none of this would have happened. His downfall wasn't the result of some elaborate conspiracy or political maneuvering. It was the natural consequence of his own choices, his own failures, his own inability to lead with honor. As we left the conference room, I walked past Harrison one more time. He looked up at me then, and I saw something in his eyes I hadn't expected recognition. Not just of who I was or who my parents were, but of what he'd lost through his own actions. He'd had the opportunity to lead, to mentor, to be part of something meaningful. Instead, he'd chosen to diminish others to prop up his own fragile ego. The uniform doesn't make a soldier, I said quietly, just loud enough for him to hear. Character does. And when arrogance replaces honor, even the highest rank will fall. Outside the Pentagon, the sun was setting over the Potomac River, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. My parents walked beside me in comfortable silence, the weight of justice finally balanced against the pain of injustice. "I'm proud of you," my father said finally. "Not for what happened in there, but for how you handled what happened 3 days ago. You showed more leadership in 5 minutes of humiliation than most officers show in their entire careers." I wanted to fight back, I admitted. Part of me wanted to tear into him right there in the briefing room. "But you didn't," my mother added. "You maintained your dignity when he lost his. You took the high road when he chose the low one. That's what real strength looks like." We drove home through the Virginia countryside, past the monuments and memorials that remind us what service really means. I thought about all the men and women who'd worn the uniform before me, who'd faced their own battles against prejudice and discrimination, who'd paved the way for people like me to serve with honor. I thought about the young recruits who might face their own Admiral Harrisons in the years to come, and I hoped that what happened in that conference room would make their path a little easier. Not because they needed protection, but because they deserved respect. That night, as I hung my uniform in the closet, I looked at my badge with new eyes. It wasn't just a piece of metal anymore. It was a symbol of everything I'd overcome, everything I'd learned, everything I'd promised to uphold. Harrison had tried to strip it away to diminish me, but in the end, he'd only made it shine brighter. 3 weeks later, I received word that Harrison was attempting to return to active duty through a legal technicality. His lawyers had found some procedural issue with his court-martial, some loophole that might allow him to challenge his dismissal. I was sitting in my new office. I'd been promoted and transferred to a position where I could actually make a difference when the news reached me. For a moment, I felt that old familiar anger rise up in my chest. The injustice of it, the possibility that he might escape consequences after all, the thought that other young officers might have to endure what I'd endured. But then I remembered my father's words from that day in the conference room. "This isn't about revenge. It's about making things right." And I smiled because I knew something Harrison didn't understand yet. He thought this was over. He thought he could find some legal maneuver to restore his career, to return to his position of authority, to pretend that none of this had ever happened. He had no idea that this confrontation had been just the beginning. The thing about real justice is that it doesn't depend on legal technicalities or procedural loopholes. It depends on truth, and truth has a way of surfacing no matter how deep you try to bury it. Harrison's attempted return to service would trigger a deeper investigation, a more thorough examination of his record, a complete accounting of every decision he'd made and every person he'd harmed throughout his career. He thought he was fighting to restore his reputation. What he was actually doing was ensuring that his legacy would be one of failure, discrimination, and the abuse of authority. Every legal motion he filed would bring more attention to his case, more scrutiny to his actions, more opportunities for his victims to tell their stories. But that's a story for another time. Because right now, sitting in my office with my badge gleaming on my chest and the knowledge that I'd survived the worst someone could throw at me, I want you to understand something important. This isn't just about military justice or one corrupt officer getting what he deserved. This is about something deeper, something that affects all of us regardless of whether we wear a uniform or not. It's about the courage to stand up for what's right even when you're standing alone. It's about maintaining your dignity when others try to strip it away. It's about understanding that respect isn't something you can demand or humiliate out of people. It's something you earn through your actions, your character, your commitment to lifting others up instead of tearing them down. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been told you don't belong, if you've ever had someone try to diminish your worth to make themselves feel bigger, remember this story. Remember that your silence can be more powerful than their noise, your dignity more impressive than their cruelty, your patience more effective than their aggression. And remember that somewhere out there, people are watching. People are keeping score. People are ready to stand with you when the moment is right, when justice can be served, when the truth can finally have its day. The uniform I wear represents something bigger than my own career or accomplishments. It represents the idea that service means something, that sacrifice has value, that honor isn't just a word we throw around, but a principle we live by. Harrison forgot that. He thought the uniform gave him license to abuse others, when in reality, it gave him the responsibility to protect and lead them. That's the difference between authority and leadership. Authority comes from rank, from position, from the power to make others do what you want. Leadership comes from character, from example, from the ability to inspire others to become better than they thought possible. Harrison had authority. My father has leadership. And that's why, in the end, there was never any real contest between them. As I finish telling you this story, I want you to think about the Admiral Harrisons in your own life. The people who use their position to diminish others, who mistake fear for respect, who think that tearing others down somehow makes them stronger. They exist in every workplace, every community, every institution where power can be abused. But I also want you to think about the General Stones, the people who use their influence to protect others, who understand that real strength comes from lifting people up, who know that leadership is about service, not self-service. They exist too, and they're often the ones who make the real difference when it matters most. The choice between being a Harrison or a Stone isn't about rank or position or natural authority. It's about character. It's about choosing to see the worth in others instead of just the threat they might pose to your ego. It's about understanding that respect is a two-way street, and the moment you stop giving it is the moment you stop deserving it. My badge is back on my chest where it belongs. My career is stronger than ever. And somewhere out there, a disgraced former admiral is learning the hardest lesson of his life, that you can't lead through fear, you can't command through cruelty, and you can't build yourself up by tearing others down. But I didn't know that this confrontation was just the beginning. Because 3 weeks later, the same admiral tried to return. And that's when things got really interesting. Like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. Because if you think this story is over, you haven't been paying attention. Justice doesn't end with one decision or one consequence. It continues, it evolves, and it finds a way to balance the scales no matter how many people try to tip them in the wrong direction. The next chapter of this story is going to show you what happens when someone who's been held accountable refuses to accept that accountability. When they try to use the system against itself, when they attempt to turn their punishment into a platform for even more damage. But that's tomorrow's battle. Today's victory is knowing that when someone tries to strip away your dignity, your worth, your right to serve with honor, there are people who will stand with you. There are systems that work when good people make them work. There are consequences for those who abuse their authority and rewards for those who maintain their integrity under pressure. That briefing room where I was humiliated 3 days ago? It's been renamed. They call it the Lieutenant Stone briefing room now, in honor of what happened there, what was learned there, what was changed there. Because sometimes the places where we're broken become the places where we're strongest. Sometimes the moments that seem like endings are actually beginnings. And sometimes the people who try to destroy us end up building monuments to our resilience instead. The badge on my chest carries more weight now. Not because it's different metal or different fabric, but because it represents something that was tested and proven unbreakable. It represents the kind of strength that doesn't come from intimidation or authority, but from character and conviction and the refusal to let others define your worth. Admiral Harrison thought he could break me with humiliation. Instead, he forged me into something stronger. He thought he could end my story. Instead, he just wrote the opening chapter of a much better one. And that, more than any punishment or consequence, is the real victory here. Not that he fell, but that I rose. Not that he was diminished, but that I was elevated. Not that justice was served, but that honor was preserved. The sun sets differently now when I see it through my office window. It doesn't mark the end of another day spent proving I belong. It marks the end of another day spent serving something bigger than myself, protecting others the way I was protected, leading the way I was taught to lead. Because that's what we do. We serve. We protect. We lead by example. And when someone tries to stop us, we remember that the uniform doesn't make the soldier, character does. And character, once forged in the fire of adversity, becomes unbreakable. This is what it means to serve with honor. This is what it means to lead with integrity. This is what it means to understand that respect isn't demanded, it's earned. One decision at a time, one action at a time, one moment of choosing to do what's right over what's easy. Admiral Harrison forgot that lesson. But I'll never forget it. And neither should you. The story continues tomorrow. The fight for dignity, for respect, for the right to serve with honor, it never really ends. But that's okay. Because now I know something I didn't know 3 days ago. I know exactly who I am. I know exactly what I'm worth. And I know exactly what I'm fighting for. And that's a knowledge that no one, no matter how much authority they think they have, can ever take away from me again.